Today I want to show you just a cool way to make pretty complex shapes. And this isn't just for making smiling people. This is a really good way to learn how to make almost anything. So what I'm doing is basically starting out by showing you our final result, and now I'll show you how to make it. So let's delete all our nodes. To make a circle, one way we can do it is by finding the length of all vectors. So just using a vector math node, setting it to length, we can get this gradient. And using a math node, we can use an operation that I haven't showed in a previous video before. We can use the compare function, which gives us two values. This epsilon is essentially the thickness of our ring. In this case, it's a ring. It can actually be anything, but because we have this gradient, it's a ring. And this value slider essentially chooses how far away it is from the center. So I'm going to keep this at 0.5, and I'm going to make the thickness pretty thin, about 0.04. From here, I can actually duplicate this node and keep the links intact by holding Shift Command or Control if you're on Windows and pressing D. So now we have two of the same nodes that do the same thing. But in this bottom one, the second one, I want to make it a bit smaller, decreasing its value, and keep the epsilon the same. Now we have two rings. So let's add these together using just an add node. Now you'll see we have these two rings. But what I want to do is subtract from this bottom ring. So I can do this by taking our object coordinates and getting a gradient texture. Now I can set it to radial and subtract by 0.5. Now what we can do is use an absolute node, an absolute operation, to flip our negatives. Now you'll see we have basically a value of 0 on this side and a value of 1, and these are mirrored. That's a very useful tool because now we can use a less than operation to make a bit of an angled wedge shape. So I'm going to do something like this, but you'll notice it's horizontal, it's pointing to the left. What I would like to do is have this arrow or point upwards. So I'm going to rotate it with the vector rotate node by about 90 degrees. Now it's pointing upwards. What I can do now is multiply this smaller circle by this triangle. What that will do is find where they're overlapping. So let's do that. That's it. Now we have a smile, little smiling noodle shape. And when they're added together, we get a bit of a happy face. We can make him smile a lot or very little. I'll leave it about there. Something like this. Here. Now let's add the eyes. The eyes can be made with just circles. I'm going to add a vector math node, set it to length again, and I'm going to do a very useful operation called separate and combine. And now I'm going to plug in all of the axes that are corresponding with each other. X goes to X, Y goes to Y, and Z goes to Z. Z is unimportant because we're doing 2D, but it is still useful to combine them all. Now what I want to do is add a math node set to less than to make a solid circle. And we can make it pretty small. This is for an eye. And now we'll see that the reason we're doing this combine and separating function here with the separate to X and combine to X and Y, we can now flip the X and mirror it. So all we're saying is that we're taking this X and only the X, flipping the negatives, and combining them back again, which gives us this coordinate system. This is very useful. this is basically a mirroring tool. So now you'll notice if we move our circle, it's doubled. And it's only doubled on the x-axis. One of the many use cases of math. So now we can just simply add our eyes. It doesn't really matter the order that you do it, but we can add our eyes, and you'll see they're very, very big. So let's shrink them down by changing our threshold. And let's move them up and a bit together. You can decide the proportions of your face. This is just a quick introduction to how you can make something like this using only nodes.